Barricades. My name is Boyan Stanislavski, and I'm one of the co-hosts of this show. The other co-host, Dr. Maria Chernat, is currently vacationing, so I'll be here alone, or actually not exactly alone, because recently I had the honor of interviewing two prominent U.S. peace activists, Medea Benjamin, founder of Code Pink, Women Against War, and author of a recently published book on the war in Ukraine. And Wright, a former U.S. State Department official who resigned in protest against the war in Iraq. What struck me most during this long conversation was, I think, the emotion, the passion, and the seriousness of commitment both Medea and Anne have for opposing U.S. imperialism and advocating for peace and understanding and diplomacy. And now for the interview, it's divided into three parts, each of which is equally interesting.
Okay, so let's start with what brought you to Europe. What was it?
Well, we came for a conference in Vienna that we have been planning for a couple of months to bring people from, particularly from Europe, but also from US, Canada, and the Global South together to talk about how can we build a movement for peace in Ukraine. We know that there are leaders of countries like the president of Brazil, now the president of South Africa and other African nations, the Pope, who are trying to promote peace talks. But we really feel that this needs to come from below, and it needs to come from the NATO countries. The pressure has to come from us. So this was an attempt to come together, to learn together, to talk together, and to put out a call, which we're doing now for the end of September and early October, for actions around the world calling for peace talks and negotiations.
Right, so that's very interesting, and you don't get to hear much about that in the media. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the organizers, or how did it all come about? I believe the conference has got to be a result of preparations, months of preparations. So who participated? What were the most, if you can maybe tell us the most important leaders or participants in that conference. How about that?
Well, the original ones were the International Peace Bureau, which is an old, very old peace organization that is based in Berlin right now, but it covers not only Europe, but the Global South as well. And then a coalition in the United States called Peace in Ukraine, which is a group of about 100 different organizations. My organization, Code Pink Women for Peace, started that coalition. And then another group that was very actively involved is the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, also known by the acronym WILF. And they have a lot of chapters in different countries. Those were some of the key organizations. And of course, we couldn't have done it without Austrian peace groups and research institutes and university professors who all played an important role in getting the logistics and in trying to get government support. And I think it's important to say that one of the main support was coming from the trade union movement, the Confederation of Trade Unions, which is
in Austria,
the largest trade union in Austria, who had offered us the place for free. Mm-hmm. And we were very excited and planned all along to do it there until just 2 days before the event was to take place. We got a notice that they got cold feet. That they got very nervous because there was a lot of pressure on them, particularly from the Ukrainian ambassador to Austria, that was saying, this is a group of Putin apologists, these are people that you shouldn't be hosting, and that kind of pressure made them back out at the last minute. We thought at one moment we were going to have to hold this conference in a public square, mm-hmm. But luckily we found a lovely place. It was a concert hall to hold the event. And another example of the backlash we felt was that the press club that was going to host the press conference when the conference ended also pulled out,
Yeah.
and we had to then do that in a cafe. But despite the backlash and the attempts to try to cancel the whole event, it went forward I would say, great success, in that the panels were very interesting. There was some diversity of opinion, but everybody came together knowing that what brought us together was, we don't think there's a victory on the battlefield. We think there needs to be a ceasefire and negotiations. And then within that, there were lots of differences about how that might possibly take place, what it could look like, what concessions would have to be made. And the other thing I think is important to mention is that there was a panel as well as participation from Ukrainians and Russians, but they got a lot of backlash for participating before it started and then even afterwards. And in fact, we had to offer some particular protection for some of the people who participated. All of this is to say that it is just a terrible state of affairs when there is a war raging, and talk about peace is considered subversive, is considered treasonous, is considered an apologist for a regime that we condemn for their invasion.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's amazing, but that's actually cancel culture at its purest, I suppose, right? This is it. And then, when you mentioned the trade unions, I think that's extraordinary that they were actually even prepared to host it, because in Poland, I can quite imagine this even happening. This is like anyone who steps out, like 1 centimeter, regardless of to which direction, out of from the mainstream, they get very severely repressed. And it's amazing that in a NATO, well, no, Austria is not in NATO, but in a European country, in a Central European, Western European country, you were able to actually get together so many people, and despite the kind of obstacles, you were able to actually carry out the whole event. So
yeah, I just want to say let's remember that Austria is a neutral country, and that's one of the reasons, a major reason why we chose it. And the other thing to recognize is that in some of the European countries, and particularly in Italy, the trade unions are very much behind this movement for peace. In fact, Italy is the country that has had the largest demonstrations for peace, over 100,000 people out in the streets. And that's precisely because there is a long history of the Catholic Church, the peace movement, and the trade unions working together.
Of course, I think even in Eastern Europe, and this is being widely dismissed all over the media, we've had demonstrations, significant demonstrations, 100,000, even over 100,000, I think, in Czech Republic last year and this year. We have repeated demonstrations in Bulgaria, the country where I come from, every 2 weeks or every 3 weeks, something like that, marches for peace and stability. And again, no reflection in the international media whatsoever. And of course, there are demonstrations in Serbia, Moldova, countries we don't hear much from. So, but anyway, I think it's absolutely remarkable that you were able to make this international event, and despite all those problems that you faced, to actually carry it out. And I wonder, what was the reception? Because apart from the people who participated in the very conference, that you said you had press conference afterwards, and what was the reception? What questions were asked, how people actually received the...
Well, Anne was a major featured speaker, both on the panels that was about diplomats because of her history, and also at the press conference.
Mm-hmm. I, as a retired U.S. Army colonel and a former U.S. diplomat who resigned over a war 20 years ago, in 2003, I resigned from the U.S. government in opposition to Bush's war on Iraq. So, for the last 20 years, I've been asked to speak at various peace events, anti-war events, and so I was honored to get an invitation to speak at this conference. And one of the plenary sessions that I spoke on was on ceasefires, how you get to a ceasefire so that you can then go forward with some sort of agreement to stop the killing. Now, the main things I think all of us want is the killing to stop. We are aghast and horrified at the numbers of people that have been killed in Ukraine primarily, but also in Russia. And so trying to get the wars to end, the battles to end, so the killing would stop is kind of the main purpose of a ceasefire. So talking about ceasefires, but how long it takes to get an agreement on a ceasefire. And one of the things I spoke about was during the Korean War 70 years ago, it took 2 years, and it was only a 3-year war, but it took 2 of those years, 575 meetings between the North Koreans, South Koreans, the US, the UN command, to finally come up with an armistice.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about your panel. How do you get to a ceasefire in a situation like that, where there seem to be no incentives for a ceasefire? Russia will not probably suggest ceasefire because they seem to be actually winning on the battlefield. No matter that we feel that there can be no final victory on the battlefield, they seem to be winning. And they seem to be very confident. On the other hand, we have NATO, or Ukraine/NATO, which doesn't seem to be interested in any kind of ceasefire because it would lose a lot of credibility, faith, prestige. And we seem to be in a conflict which is really a matter of life and death for both sides. Like in terms of the security guarantees for Russia that it needs to now fight for in the fields of Ukraine. And then on the other side, NATO, which risks pretty much everything, its own existence, if it actually loses in a way that media are not able to portray as some kind of victory. So how do you get to a ceasefire in a situation like that? Is 600 meetings going to be enough?
Well, who knows? I mean, it may be a horrific incident that happens, that finally the leaders of both countries, or the leader of one set of, whether it's US, NATO, Ukraine, whether it's the Russian Federation, one of those entities may finally say, this was enough, we've got to stop this, and make overtures toward the other.
Yeah, okay, but
and I'll just mention, if you look back at another war, in the Vietnam War, the U.S. Started negotiations with the North Vietnamese in 1968. 1968. A peace agreement was not signed in Paris till 1973, and during that time, the U.S. increased the level of bombing of North Korea, of North Vietnam. They started bombing Cambodia, Laos. I mean, it was horrible. More casualties happened during that period, and that could certainly happen here. But at a certain point, the U.S. got pressure from its own citizens saying, this has gone on way too long. We've already lost 50,000, which was minor compared to how many Vietnamese were killed.
Yeah, and also compared to the casualties of this war thus far. I mean, it's been horrendous, right? So I wonder about, what about this pressure, internal pressure? Are there any signs out there creating, like making us feel that there are perhaps some prospects for this kind of movement or of this scale that could actually put pressure on the American government? Because they all seem to be, like NATO and of course the United States as the political leader of NATO, they seem to be absolutely hell-bent on, Ukraine must win. And they keep repeating that. And my observation is that they seem to believe their own sort of concepts, propaganda, whatever you want to call it. And what you mentioned about leaders coming to conclude that, okay, that was enough. We've had that in May or April last year, haven't we had that? The meetings in Minsk, then in Ankara, in Istanbul, and quite recently, I think Vladimir Putin actually showed to the press the documents that were actually signed. And after they were signed, the Ukraine side was made to back down and depart from the whole deal. So obviously, we're talking about a situation where ceasefire is almost out of the scope of.
Well, it may be right now out of the scope of your thoughts.
Yeah.
But that was one of the reasons that we had this conference, is that people of conscience have to continue to talk about the need to stop the killing, the need to have peace. And that's where you have the global South coming in saying, We're not even a part of this,
Mhm.
but we can see objectively this is terrible. And we urge you, please, beg of you to stop this killing. So while there may not be specific things that are happening between US, NATO, Ukraine, and then the Russian Federation, there are influences that are coming in from all sides, which hopefully will have some impact.
Yeah, I would want to add a couple of things. One is let's not minimize the importance of the Chinese
Mhm.
and how much leverage they have both on Russia and on Ukraine for being the number one trading partner of both of them. I mean, it's quite remarkable how important China is. And the other is the support for the war in Ukraine, I would say in the United States, and I don't know in Europe, but I would venture to say the same, is about an inch deep. I mean, people say, oh, yes, we want to support Ukraine. They used to put their flags out and everything. Now they don't talk about it. They don't care about it. The opinion polls keep showing more and more people just want to see an end to that conflict. And so you see this tremendous chasm between what the politicos, what the people in power are saying and doing, whether it's in the US or in other NATO countries, and what the people think. And this shows a lack of real respect for democracy. It shows that this is a political war. And so when you look at the United States, you have to recognize we're coming up to a presidential election. And that I feel in so many ways that the poor Ukrainian people and the poor Russian soldiers are dying because Biden needs a win for his reputation and his presidential campaign.
If it can be saved, I mean, his reputation. I mean, just
Yeah.
by the amount of memes that are going out, only that is kind of enough.
Right, but as this election season moves on, the Democrats are going to be in a very difficult position if they can't point to any victories in Ukraine and Republican and other Democratic challengers start coming forward, as they are right now, saying this war doesn't make sense and this is Biden's war. And so if you put a number of those different things together, while a ceasefire might not look feasible right this minute, I think things could change very quickly.
Well, yeah, I guess it's of course possible, although there are many people who are of the opinion that this war could actually last for decades ahead, because none of the sides will want to actually back down.
I think they're going to run out of ammunition.
Yeah, that's actually the only hope.
Yeah.
That's the only hope, that
Well,
they're going to run out of the.
The military supplies of the United States apparently are dwindling. We don't have the industrial complex left in the United States to ratchet up the amount of ammunition that you need in order to continue to supply the Ukrainian military. The U.S. Military complex, industrial complex, is not geared up to start manufacturing in large numbers the amount that is being expended right now in Ukraine. Although I think they're starting it up because they want to have a supply for a potential war in China.
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
Tragically.
this is the most. This is really a horrendous prospect, because now they seem to be losing one proxy war in Ukraine. Then they want to open another front with China, maybe with Iran. I mean, this really sounds like something which is terribly unhinged.
Well, you have Blinken, though, who just this week has gone to China, and that's the first overture really that we've had in quite a while. So
Yeah, I think they're starting to realize that they better not open up a war with China at a time when we've run out of munitions. You know? And so this, in a sense, is, one positive silver lining is perhaps it's a time for more cooperation with China. And I also think it's important to recognize that within the United States, there is also a difference between some of the people who are making the policy right now, like in the National Security Council and in the White House, and people in the Pentagon who have been the cooler heads.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
What an irony that now we have to trust you know, the
Well,
military.
we don't have to trust them. What we see is in documents that were leaked.
Yeah.
It's not that they came out and said this. I mean, yes, the chair of the Joint Chief of Staffs at one point said we should seize the moment and Ukraine should go for negotiations. But
he had to leak it. He was not able to say that, you know.
no, he said it publicly twice.
He did say that. Okay.
He said it publicly, yeah. But then there were these leaked documents, and the leaked documents is where we see the reality of the situation, which says that the Russians have a lot of problems with their everything from their logistics and communications and weapon supply, but the Ukrainians have the same problems. And saying that if there is some success in this counteroffensive, it's not going to be enough to make any significant change in the battlefield. And so you see these leaked documents, you understand that the Pentagon knows what's going on. And that despite that, though, we have these neocons in the policy-making positions, and then you have the Republican hawks who are egging Biden on and saying, why are you not doing more? You're just hemming and hawing. You're not going all in to help the Ukrainians. You're just, stepping your toe in and giving a little bit of munitions here, a little bit of, F-16s, a little bit of tanks. You should, give it your all. So there are these very different pressures and divisions that are going on, but they're shifting very quickly.
And I would just add to that having been in the U.S. military for 29 years, the level of influence, wars don't start because the U.S. military want them. They start because the political leaders of the United States want them to start. And then they tell the military to go ahead and implement war plans that, of course, the military has. The military has a war plan for everything, but they don't make the decisions on it. So it's the neocons, it's whatever war hawk group that happens to be in power that makes the decision. And many times behind the scenes, the military is warning, we don't have this, we don't have that, we're not ready for this, we're not ready for that. And they're told, like Donald Rumsfeld in going into Iraq, you go in with whatever you have. If you don't have enough stuff, that's too bad.
Okay, but the Iraq war is somewhat different from this one in many aspects, actually, and I think it's important to draw those differences here. The war in Iraq had some clear economic objectives, like the oil, the resources, the saving of the or preventing Saddam Hussein from departing from the dollar. There were many rather clear objectives, clearly defined. Whereas here, I can't see much apart from ideological obsession that we just have to take down Russia. We just have to do that for reasons which I don't quite understand. Like, what is the problem with Russia? How is Russia threatening in any way? How it was threatening, how it has been threatening maybe the United States or even their imperialist interests? I just don't quite see. The only thing that Russia seems to have requested all along was don't expand NATO, adhere to the promises that you made. And that was it. And today, when I hear people like Jeffrey Zatz, who come up with new revelations that back in 1992, plans were actually made to include Ukraine in NATO, then I come to think that, it's just ideological obsession and Russia derangement syndrome. I can't see anything else. Can you?
No.
Okay.
I totally
That was a very
agree.
short
When you look at it objectively, why in the world would this be going on? Other than the Russian Federation had said there are red lines, and the U.S. and NATO just kept going over the red lines, over them. And as Medea has identified in her book so well, all of the U.S. government officials, starting back in the 1990s, had been saying to the U.S. government, no matter what administration it was, don't cross these red lines. Niet is niet.
Exactly, that was Robert Kennan's, I think.
No, it was Bill Burns.
Bill Burns.
When he was the U.S. ambassador to Moscow. But Kennan, years before, had said similar sorts of things, but it was niet. It means niet was the title of his diplomatic cable back to Washington.
But I think there are economic factors that we shouldn't discard. I remember I go into a lot of congressional hearings, and going into hearings years ago when there were senators from Texas, like Ted Cruz, who would be hammering the administration and saying, why are you allowing this Nord Stream pipeline to be built? I didn't even know what the Nord Stream pipeline was. And seeing, and so I had to go research, what is this?
Yeah.
And then why would Ted Cruz be so obsessed with the Nord Stream pipeline? Well, now you understand. It was because the Texas oil companies and the gas companies wanted to be the ones to supply Europe with the energy and not Russia. And so you see, with the blowing up of this pipeline and the sanctions against Russian energy, the oil companies in Texas and throughout the United States, but they're mainly based in Texas, have had profits that they've never seen before. Their profits in 2022 were off the charts.
The interesting thing about it is that Russia's oil companies and gas companies, their profits are also going through the roof because, apparently they sell now to China, to India, to Saudi Arabia, to Qatar, and then those countries, they subsequently resell that oil to Europe. So we've sanctioned ourselves in a very strange manner, basically, because we now buy the same Russian gas or same Russian, oil only through other countries.
But the other consequence, which is a long-term consequence in the U.S., is that the war has been used as an excuse to expand licenses for production of oil and gas and refineries in the United States. So the work of a lot of environmental movements over years to try to stop this, then when the war happened, Biden was then, okay, now we have to help our brothers and sisters in Europe. And so I think it's an important economic factor to take in mind that's not going to end when the war ends, because there's going to be a lot of pressure on the Europeans to keep buying energy from the United States. So that's one factor. And let's also not forget that war does make a lot of money for some very powerful companies, the weapons manufacturers, the companies that have contracts with the Pentagon. And in Europe, you know better than I do how there's been a real tension between the pressure from the United States to tell the NATO countries to spend more of their GDP on weapons, and the people's needs who've been saying, wait, we want healthcare, we want education, we don't want that. Well, now that's opened up. And so there's powerful companies, not just in the United States, but throughout Europe now, who see this as a tremendous opportunity to produce and sell more weapons. So there are economic interests.
Yeah. So what about the military-industrial complex in the United States? I guess their profits and the prospects for future profits, this is really their moment, because the entire equipment that's been used by NATO armies in Europe, I mean, most of it is burning or has burned in the fields of Ukraine, on the fronts of the Ukrainian war. So now, obviously, those countries like Poland, for example, where we're recording this video today, they're going to have to rearm. And of course, they're going to be buying from where? From the United States. So I suppose this is another kind of, a major investment on the part of the military-industrial complex, right?
Indeed it is, yeah. And those companies are taking good advantage of it from their perspective. They are really holding the U.S. government kind of by the neck. And they're getting sole source contracts. They're demanding that the intellectual property to create certain types of things remains with them, not with the U.S. government. So it's a situation where the companies are making a killing and are putting themselves in a position where they really have the U.S. government over the barrel on a variety of issues.
And for them, it doesn't matter who wins the war or when.
No, what is important for them is that the war keeps going. And there was an expose that in the U.S. television that showed that these companies are now getting 40% profits.
Wow.
That's huge profits.
Yeah, 60 Minutes.
Yeah.
I think did a special, well, half of an hour special that was really, really interesting about how all of these big companies are taking advantage of the wars.
Yeah. But they're not really interested in the political perspective of it, right? Because, if there was a pinch of rational thought in the whole thing, then this reckless act of imperialism basically brings the end of the empire closer rather than expanding the life of the empire itself. What I'm trying to say is that a major defeat in Ukraine could actually be the symbolic beginning of the end of the empire. And those companies, they're not going to be very happy about that.
Yeah, but let's remember it was Russia that invaded.
Yeah.
So, while the US provoked and NATO provoked, it was Russia that invaded. And these companies are now taking advantage of the situation. And I think also, of course, NATO is, because NATO did not have a very good reputation before this war. And those weapons manufacturers didn't either, because, they lost, the US and NATO lost wars constantly. And so now they have the image of they're promoting democracy. They are the faces of positive support for victims of an invasion. So I think they have gained a lot out of this.
Mm. So you think that thanks to this PR, like constant PR stunts that we are facing like almost every day, that it could actually, this interpretation that I just floated here could not be such an important element in the whole thing?
Well, I think that in the more long run, what we're seeing is a major shift in geopolitics, and how even before this war that was happening, where the U.S. is not the sole superpower, and we see China being so important and almost ready to overtake U.S. Economically, and also the configuration of the countries that are part of the BRICS now representing a larger global output than the Western Europe and the United States represent. So that shift is happening. I think you're right in that it speeds it up to the extent that we see so many countries in the global south, particularly Africa, Latin America, who recognize the hypocrisy of all of this. And I think you're seeing a bigger division between the U.S., Europe and its sphere, which is smaller and smaller, and those who don't want to be forced to take sides in a process.
Yeah, okay, that's of course understandable. But then, I think that this division, decoupling, whatever you want to call it, it started quite a long time ago. We only now see this reaction on the part of America, and this is how I see it, at least, which which looks quite desperate. Like in the final aftermath, you throw yourself into a proxy war with Russia. And regardless of the fact that, technically speaking, of course, you're right, like Russia invaded, and, we should not whitewash, Russia, this responsibility. But there really seems to be something reckless about it, something that I've not seen so far, being a rather careful observer of international affairs on the part of the United States, in the sense that they've thrown themselves into something. Everybody, the biggest strategist of American imperialism, like even Kissinger saying, like, don't do this. This is really, you're going way over the top. You're not going to be able to handle this, right? And yet they still went ahead and did it. So it really smells of desperation, smells of something profoundly irrational.
I would say more than desperation, it's hubris. It's, the U.S. got itself in these wars in Iraq and in Afghanistan. Imagine losing a war in Afghanistan. Yeah. It's insane. And yet you still think that you can win. And so I think that's the kind of imperial hubris, is to think that even after it's been shown, especially in these last 20 plus years, that the U.S. just keeps losing and losing. The narrative is that we don't lose. And so we might as well throw ourselves into the next war, because it's a chance to show how powerful we are.
That's true, but don't you find that, losing in Afghanistan in a humiliating manner, okay? But losing in Afghanistan is something that doesn't threaten the very existence of the empire. This is okay, we've lost that war, we had to evacuate, whatever. People are going to forget about it because the news cycle 24/7 and so on and so forth. Whereas here, this is, I feel, maybe I'm wrong, like I'm not really an expert, but I feel that it could be different. It could really be a major blow. You can already see countries in Africa and Latin America that demonstrate we don't fear you anymore. We don't fear any consequences that America is going to come down on us and crush us or something. So do you see any logic in what I'm talking? What I'm saying?
Well, I think the empire itself doesn't see any logic at all. Their view is we're doing the right thing. We're fine. We go after whatever we want. We'll succeed. But the reality is that it's showing its the wear and tear on these types of ideas, that you can just go in and have a war place and challenge something like another superpower like Russia, and get away with it. And you're seeing you're not getting away with it, and that there's a price to be paid. And while it's the Ukrainian people that are paying the price,
the biggest price, right? The political price is also being paid by the United States, as I said. Like other governments not fearing them anymore.
That's right. I mean, if you compare Iraq with the coalition of the willing, what was it, like 40 countries that were put together? You just twist their arms and say, if you don't do this, you won't be getting this or that or whatever.
Now you can only do that with Poland.
You can't do that anymore. And it is quite remarkable to see even close U.S. allies like India that say, no, actually, we're looking out for our own interest. Yeah. And so I think that is a remarkable shift.
And they Saudi get invaded.
And Saudi Arabia, which was like, had this incredible relationship with the United States for decades now, suddenly turns around and says, you can't tell us what to do. We're
we're gonna restore relations with Iran, right?
Yeah.
All that stuff.
So yes, you're right in that sense that it is a moment when countries see this country or this empire is not so powerful anymore. We don't have to do what the U.S. says. On the other hand, let's not also pretend that U.S. sanctions haven't had a horrific impact and continue to have a horrific impact in countries around the world and are killing people everywhere. We work a lot with our colleagues in places like Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, even Iran, which is a much bigger country. And these sanctions really do kill, and they do affect. And the U.S., in its desperate years of a declining empire, continues to use that as a cudgel. And a lot of countries are now saying, well, we're just going to get off the dollar. But in the meantime, it's these smaller countries that are feeling the pain.
And I'd like to remind you that the Barricade is an independent media outlet based in Bulgaria, which I co-run with a colleague from Bucharest, Dr. Maria Cernat, whom I mentioned already. Check out our website, our YouTube channel, and our channels on Rumble and Odyssey. Our videos are also available on Substack, where you can also find audio versions of our podcasts and articles. Our audio productions are also available on Spotify and SoundCloud. And one more important, I think, remark: none of our videos or audios are monetized. If you see an advertisement in the middle of the podcast, feel free to skip it. It doesn't help us in any way. If you believe our journalistic efforts are important and worthy of your support, then please consider subscribing to our channel, sharing with your friends and followers, and making a one-off donation or purchasing a monthly subscription through Patreon or Substack. The description box contains all the necessary links. You can also help to support our Eastern European independent journalism by using our media company, Nonstop Media, for all kinds of commercial purposes. We've worked in media, reporting, design, video, audio, and text editing, publishing, translations, interpreting, event planning, and a variety of other fields. We have fantastic specialists on board who can do amazing things with words and images. For more information, go ahead and visit our website at nonstopmedia.eu. Thank you.